Arcade experiences were once much more avidly sought after, both by consumers and developers alike. It would be an experience typically less than an hour long, especially given proficient play. A play session that's chock full of different things to see and do, but in rapid succession, like quickly visiting numerous attractions once, before moving on to another. The pacing and delivery of content is a fast stream, always throwing new things at the player in terms of challenges and assets. Wild Guns fits a similar bill to many such old experiences, even if it doesn't have an arcade equivalent to point to, as it was only initially released on the Super Nintendo. It started its life as a project that somehow became much larger than its original pitch. I make this partly as a self-indulgent video to shine light on a game I wish was much more well known than it already is, given its quality lets it sit on my top 10 games for its respective console, being one that achieved its vision rather remarkably, especially with the developer limitations it had. It's a game where the love gleams, and it's hard to point to one select part of the game that drags down the experience the most, or any that do to a significant degree, only amounting to a small list of qualms I have with this game. Nonetheless, I wanted to start with a significant part of both of its regional variants, that being everything that came with it outside of the game itself, the manuals and box arts. To supplement many games of its era, we have worthwhile physical media to take a gander at. Thankfully in this case I found both the Japanese and American versions, because all too often the Japanese versions of games just don't have their manuals archived. The Japanese box art displays a very faithful look to our two protagonists instead of an overly anime style. They decided to stick to their guns on how this game looks. It's pretty bold with a big wooden and shiny logo on top, a few bullet holes, and the main characters given a solid half of the box space just for themselves. It gets the point across well, although I'm not a fan of the first boss being so hidden in the shade of red-orange on the bottom. It's hard to tell what's going on to the right of it, even if it's likely a city set ablaze. But for it being this obscured, it comes off as a mismatch and afterthought to the rest. I would have just had both characters pose and put the big mech behind them, so the sci-fi elements aren't an afterthought, and thus giving all three much more equal representation. The back gives a standard view of random screenshots, with an attempt to glaze what the game consists of. It's nothing special, creative, or dumbfounding, just average. The bullet holes that are here look like boogers, I guess. In the Japanese manual, there's a surprising amount of substance. Roughly 25 pages of information are packed in, and little space goes unused. I like the choice of the sack texture they settled on for most of it instead of a bland, basic, solid color. The top is also clear as to what each section is describing, and in different colored words too, for easier scanning with less reliance on the glossary. The targeted numbers on the bottom of each page is also a neat touch. It's all formatted and organized neatly, while making sure to explain most game mechanics and even some more niche things such as a few enemy traits that might go unnoticed, or how held dynamite won't explode until a player throws it. It's all good for a refresher or a quick crash course for most enemies and mechanics present, even if there's nothing extravagant like making jokes or adding witty descriptions. That's close to the only thing this manual is missing, frankly. The entire 2 pages worth of story, and small paragraphs for each of the main characters this game has at the start of the manual is a nice bit of flavor text to set up the slice of plot present, which is in stark contrast to the single line of dialogue each character has in the demo display. Pause if you care to read it, but in summation, Annie hired Clint, a well-known bounty hunter, for assistance in her revenge against King Kid for murdering her entire family. They're both a tenacious duo that are out for blood, but for their own completely selfish reasons, managing to be different from the typical trope of good guys wanting to save the world, do justice, or mystical heroes of legend. It's a unique enough premise that is far from cookie-cutter or generic. As for the US box art, it's your expectedly needlessly gritty, serious representation of the actual product. Even with this game being very no-nonsense, such soulless robots or a "death to all" facial expression are still too much. Not to mention the design inaccuracies with how over-designed all of this is. The main characters are also colored and designed incorrectly, which while the Japanese version had a small inaccuracy or two, this one represents Annie in a different dress, and outright missing her shoulder pads, and a dark blue color that's too far from its in-game version. Clint also gets a completely weird redesign. He's still this buff macho marksman, but his chest plating and brown undershirt are gone. Now in place is a standard white flannel shirt. His big, tattered robe has been turned into a leather vest, and is also accompanied by a small bandana around his neck. It's not a bad redesign though, and I could see a theoretical, ideal version mixing aspects of both. The US version at least gets points for being a good, big landscape that's much more representative of the action, and presents way more enemies to get across the point of this being a sci-fi western mix. Another thing to note is this little bit of text here saying this is the first sci-fi western game, which seems like a decent, truthful selling point, alongside the ones of this game being co-op, arcadey, and having intense shoot-'em-up action. I didn't have an easy way of confirming if this was actually the first game of being a mix of these two genres, but after several years of retro game expertise, it feels pretty likely in the realm of possibility. The back is pretty standard and it's fine enough, a partly carved out version of the front with the little snippet having most of this game's story, surprisingly not hiding the fact that Annie's parents were killed instead of just saying they were captured and hidden somewhere. No censorship here, somehow. Aside that, there's some okay standard screenshots of different stages and bosses. Nothing special here either. It's all fine. It's a big surprise then that the American manual's in full color, even with the low production costs this game had. Even some bigger budget games around this time settled on a bland, monochromatic look to their manuals. I like the little doodles found everywhere, trying to make up for the empty space they ended up with. It's probably the best compromise they ended up with for the unfortunately completely gutted boss, story, and enemy info. It's all just vanished. Likely for no other reason than lack of care, or lack of a reliable translator, though in the case of the latter, it really wouldn't have been hard to make original descriptions, I don't think. Same for the change to a boring, plain white, compared to the sack look of the pages once present. That was another loss on top of the beef that's been cut out. It's at least a serviceable amount of information overall for a game manual. As for anything on the advertising front, this game was released as unceremoniously as the studio mandates wanted it to be since the beginning. All I could find was an exceedingly basic poster online, no commercials or notable marketing of any kind outside of this, and a few one-off reviews. This poster is hardly anything special, just showing some reviewer quotes and numbers posing the game in a positive light. There are some screenshots here that are way too small, featuring the GOOM graphics, and not showing the game in an interesting or appealing light, with the first boss shown in 2 screenshots for some reason. The main background is also an interesting choice of joining both regions of their Boxarts, but all of it is in the cluttered side. It needed some proper formatting. Now finally, onto the gameplay. The shooting gallery genre present doesn't delve into any others whatsoever. This game just sticks to the laser-focused vision it sought to deliver. A simple premise is found here, a gameplay style that's not innovative or exceedingly unique, as all of the game is spent rapidly running, dodging, and jumping left and right on a strict horizontal plane, between 1 or 2 screens worth of space. There's no such thing as lane or dimension switching, or ducking behind cover. This also extends to the potential momentary breaks with minigames occasionally dispersed throughout, being the score attack option for the main menu, but split and inserted into different points between stages. Even with this game going for an arcade feel, its pacing is still one of the most notable strengths. It's all thanks to a very smart and simple mechanic that caters to skilled players so they can breeze through the action at potentially blazing speeds. The little timer at the bottom middle of the screen ticks away at a set pace by default, and is lowered by 1 when an enemy is killed prior to a section ending. This needs little elaboration. Better players can more efficiently kill the constantly spawning enemies compared to those more focused on survival, possibly due to not having as good or confident playing skills. I undoubtedly see a theoretical version of this game being vastly less enjoyable to play if this player-influenced timer depletion wasn't a core element to not only getting rid of sections full of enemies faster, but also providing an occasional tug-of-war between wanting to momentarily focus on dodging, because most enemies will also die once the timer hits 0. Additionally, mild acrobatics with double jumps and dodges help serve as sometimes slightly generous tools to avoid incoming fire, as do many smaller concessions that favor players. Invincibility frames are notably present in many different mechanics where they allow for deeper risk and reward. When you do melee attacks, throw dynamite, and dodge rolling, they all give you invincibility just long enough to let people commit at the snap of one's fingers. An additional safety net is present, with enemy fire being something that can be nullified with the player's own shots in retaliation, so it's another way good aim is rewarded well. The speech bubble above a character's head is likewise a very good warning to get out of the way for those who might need a quick reminder to dodge if they've been focused on a single target for too long, at the minor cost of being a very slight detriment to this game's immersion. Extra credit goes to the blue lassos as a supplemental mechanic to regularly dished out firepower. They're surprisingly well balanced even though they straight up freeze most foes, even extending to bosses. They provide a rewarded reprieve from some of the more annoying or constantly scrambling enemies by locking them in place and making them sitting ducks. This freeze time lets players hammer away and pump in a ton of lead, which is balanced due to not only some bigger threats freezing for less time, but also the initial wind-up and wait time to hit a target. Managing to connect continuous lassos on a swift target especially needs this high level of mechanical and timing mastery that brings a high reward for high skill. The more enemies on screen, the harder it also is to chain into itself. All of these factors both in the player's control, and the different gameplay challenges concoct this great, adrenaline-fueled set of reactions, followed by the afterglow of triumph, dry mouth, quivering muscles, and throbbing heart to close a level end. The best part of all of this is how changing the difficulty will not lock players out of any chunks of content needlessly, which goes against a toxic trope so avidly present in games of and after this era. The most people will miss out on is a very slightly different ending screen, but the main gameplay stays unaffected by weird, unannounced difficulty gates, just because someone might have wanted a simple difficulty modifier in order to get a foot in the door. Thanks to this game's simple nature, the developers were able to craft some very well realized and detailed environments that could stand a simple, general sprite art outside of this game's context, much more than a typical side-scrolling title, coming off more natural and grounded than artificial. They have this frame, picture-like quality as a result. The presentation is pretty solid with little to complain about, as the slightly shifting layered scenery of pretty varied Wild West locations is often well detailed with lighting, shadows, animated parts, and pretty much what one could expect of a solid looking title on this console. The most notable factor here is the inclusion of many destructible environments, a good concept that's equally well done execution-wise, simply adding visual depth and further emphasizing the destruction byproduct of the wild gunfights that will occur. Organic and inorganic parts alike get this treatment. I just wish they had gone a bit further to include the current screens that don't have this attribute. It's really just the screens with the bosses on them, but the end product is fairly up to snuff all in all. The menus and UI are generally well stylized too. The main game has everything nicely slotted into the bottom and easily distinguishable in a flash when checking lives, ammo, or remaining meter left. This is thanks partly due to not only how it's contrasted, but especially with the small little line of black right here that goes the extra mile for clarity. A majority of the characters here are expressive, and unlike some games of this era, don't look too choppy in their animation work. The main duo especially have a wide range of animations when shooting in different directions, being shot, and simply moving around. A really good example of enemies being well presented is the tiny, very far away men that come skidding down the mountain. Despite being made of less than 20 colored dots on screen, they're as lively as they could have been made. There's these little clouds of dust they make when coming down, the cute little spinning around tumble they do when they're shot while sliding, followed up by a hit to the ground as they land with a significant thump. There's the additional frame of recoil when they shoot, and how they run off screen once they've shot at the player, only to then jump from building to building. A much lesser game would have simply had them running from left to right, stopping to shoot occasionally, and calling it a day. The music that's been playing all this time doesn't need elaboration, as I've let it speak for itself. It's a constantly energetic set of tracks that supplements each moment and stage pretty well, especially with how hectic so much of this game can be. Lively, rocking, and upbeat, occasionally dipping into using whistles or synths as a supplement and representation of each of the genres it represents in a small way. Of course, I would be remiss to not go over how this game, despite being a very quick, well-paced, and smartly realized experience that sufficiently supplies people with a good kick of adrenaline, is not without its faults. The enemy and attack roster in this game is kind of on the samey side. In terms of challenges and needing to dodge hazards, enemy bullets, and projectiles, they're often a homing shot towards the player, with times to retaliate with melee hits, or tossing back dynamite being too few and far between. This also applies notably to the section end bosses who repeat too much. The Hitman robots, Steel Toms, and Bodyguards are all repeated a few times, and with no interesting differences across the few stages. A simple change of having a random, different variant of them, with more health, faster speed, or other tweaked stats that could appear alongside a simple palette swap for what version they are, would leave me much more okay with the repeated appearances. Power-ups are likewise lacking in diversity, and heavily so. The three most used power-ups in the game are the shotgun with a bigger range and slower firing rate than the base weapon, the machine gun which is the base weapon but just fires faster, and the grenade gun which is a faster firing but shorter range shotgun. They're really uncreative and bland, their applications being ones that don't rely on smart thinking a vast majority of the time. The one arguably most engaging actually being the gag weapon. The challenge of optimizing power-up usage is lukewarm, besides the momentary stress and dread of trying to empty a full clip of useless pellets that don't deal damage to get a functional gun back. There's a single weapon that's separate from these guns that has its own system tied to it, but it's just a cool, half-baked idea. That would be the Vulcan gun. It can be a grace from the heavens above for some of the trickier segments in this game, but its implementation is equally tacked on as the main three power-ups. It fills up with damage dealt, and lasts for an immensely long time. The duration itself might not have been a problem if the player wasn't made completely invincible during its activation, because it just makes any challenge go straight down the pisser. Better yet, players have little to no control of when it gets activated, thanks to how the stock is automatically used when it's full, and at best someone can try and roughly gauge when it would fill up during a stage after too big of an investment of calculating damage numbers. In the worst case scenario, it'll empty a fat chunk of the bar out of your own will because it's been activated right at the end of a screen. It could have served better as a short burst, pinch ability, instead of something that just steamrolls the rest of the game for the moment. Another problem I take with this game is how the suggested order of playing stages for more points feels it was included just for the sake of having the feature. It goes against the proposed freedom of allowing for picking between 4 different stages on the select screen. And the current point system for extra lives is also pretty unusable by worse off players, while also fairly worthless to good ones. An extra life is gained for the completion of roughly one stage worth of points, but lives are also not reset when starting a new stage either. So I've had moments where I finish a stage, and I have an extra life just because of all the points the stage gave me, but I end up game overing in the next stage I pick in order to reset my lives and screen nukes to 2. Bombs should have also been refilled each time you finish a stage, for similar reasons. The current control layout could have also used more face buttons. It's an okay layout in this iteration, but alongside having more freeform remapping since currently someone can only choose between different presets, only 3 face buttons are used at once by default, with both shoulder buttons and select going completely untouched. There's some clutter going on with the last was relegated to mashing the fire button, and the Vulcan gun could have also been triggered by its own dedicated mapping too. Many of these issues can give this game a feeling of the developers unfortunately succumbing to crunch, as is too avidly prevalent in the gaming development landscape. Anyone who thinks this would be pretty valid in doing so, because this game was made in 5 months, by 5 people. A tiny skeleton crew managed to make a great, worthwhile experience, when the only goal they were initially given was to produce something quick and cheap. They were allowed basically free reign in their vision outside of inconsequential mandates like character names. Nonetheless, I still find Wild Guns to be a potentially very quick experience, with a good amount to offer both in a decently flexible difficulty, but also in its challenges and mechanical depth. While there's certainly still some rough edges, it's a game I can easily come back to and blast through, admiring its respectful nature to one's time, and yet being fairly packed with content and a flexible gameplay loop for skilled and new players alike. Playing not only on easy, but especially with a friend should be more than enough to help people finish this very concise experience. There are very few times in games where it feels a development team came together and captured lightning in a bottle, something so well made not only within the possibilities of the era, but also in regards to what the developers were capable of. When I first came across this game randomly, it felt like something made by a team easily twice in size, and yet, it defied all odds, both the passion and drive pushing this game to the heights it reached. With the 30th anniversary of Natsume on 2016, a remaster of Wild Guns was put out to coincide with it, featuring an expanded scope with new characters, up to 4-player co-op, a redone soundtrack and visuals, widescreen, and other brand new content to top it all off. Not to mention how the 3 main developers for the original were returning to give this game a modern treatment and make changes to issues they see in retrospect. Succinctly, Wild Guns Reloaded is an attempt to expand the original title in terms of its presentation and content, keeping the original spirit intact, but also adding bells and whistles to entice people to return once more. Simultaneously, much of what it does add comes off as empty calories, fails to amend most of its retained issues, while also introducing brand new problems. Beginning on a positive note, the big update to the visuals introduces a welcome coat of paint to the once more cramped aspect ratio. Stages have been redrawn so they look appropriate for widescreen, alongside how characters display very fluid idle animations thanks to more frames and a better engine. And likewise, bosses now have way more expressiveness, the big hulking behemoths breaking apart and moving their mechanical appendages in flashier ways. Guns being fired now procure emptied bullet shells as well, with menus also carrying a new, good, glossy finish. I really like the change to the select screen as one of the best graphical changes here. The one visual detriment to this remaster is very unappealing transition animations for menus and changing screens, as a pretty jarring, slime-smudged split, instead of what could have been a much more simple, cleaner dithering, or fade from black effect. The much more prevalent hook for this game was the addition of 2 extra characters, and they play wildly different from the original duo, besides the extra stages now added. Not only do both of these characters offer substantially and worthwhile playstyles, but the new levels are also very in line with the rest, those that were made nearly 2 decades before their debut. Occasionally goofy enemies paired with the in-play sci-fi tech, with fairly creative locales to boot. I couldn't find any confirmation, but all of these new gameplay additions wouldn't surprise me as cut content from the original release, since they fit right at home. Okay, well, it all looks good so far. An expanded scope with more meat to chew on, spearheaded by the original team wanting to continue their old work. Well, that leaves us to start with the manual once more, this time exclusively in digital form. And it's pretty bad. In favor of simply digitizing the original English booklet, they decided to instead make a very sloppy and lazy version that is 3 measly pages long. Wow! Now we have something that doesn't properly inform of even a third of the game's mechanics or nuances. No more enemy or boss descriptions. No more story. It's been tossed away. So much for a manual review. This manual sucks. The controls for this game are about the same, not having the improvement they needed in spite of the extra buttons controllers standardized by the time this remaster released. The triggers and right stick are unusable, by the way, even with button remapping added. There's no dedicated trigger for the Vulcan gun, still, remaining as unreliable and hard to set up as it always was. The only positive tweak to it, arguably, is how it received a decent nerf to how long it'll stay active. Not that this means much for the sloppier difficulty balancing here, because the changed difficulty options are equally ill-considered. As another very confusing implementation, a similar game length is preserved when put side by side to the original, even with the promotion of new stages, although stage length is pretty one-to-one. Here's the catch. People wanting to play the new levels need to play the respective difficulty they're tied to as well. A choice to help promote replayability and make playthroughs more different from one another is done in a way that awkwardly gatekeeps the game's content, unlike how it was originally. Regardless of how much of a knuckle-dragging, mouth-breathing decision this is, the beginner difficulty just shatters any challenge thanks to enabling unlimited lives. There was an utter failure to hit a good compromise between smoothing the difficulty curve and sticking to needing a particular skill threshold to progress through the game. All they needed to do was add 1 stage checkpoint for easy, and a checkpoint for every designated screen on beginner. Worse yet, anyone playing on easy or above won't have their lives reset to 2 when starting a stage. I also can't suggest playing with friends anymore for anyone struggling, because everyone shares the same pool of lives in multiplayer. Well, when comparing both versions, the original Wild Guns stands taller. The remaster adds a few nice considerations to make it feel like a more complete experience, but also doesn't fix many still present blemishes, and introduces a surprising amount of new ones. The heart and soul of the original developers doesn't feel constrained or missing, but simply misguided, keeping Wild Guns Reloaded from being the marvelous remake it could have been. I wouldn't call it bad, I would never call it bad, but what it does add is more superfluous than meaningful, the strong foundation of the original being what keeps this remaster afloat. The new content gives a window into what could have been, and is of comparable quality to the rest, but it also doesn't give this version what it needed to retain players better. Regardless, although the remaster sits a rung or two below the original, I'd say someone can't go too wrong with either choice.